Hi, and welcome to another Good Eye podcast. My name is Jay Smack, your trusty host and producer. You can find out more about this show, as always, at goodeyepodcast.com and reach out at goodeyepodcast@gmail.com with any feedback, topic suggestions, bookings, etc., etc. Today, my guest is Aaron Lee. Aaron is an expert at finding your leadership voice. He's a leadership coach, a growth guide, a speaker. He started out with 9 nonprofits and now also works with for-profit organizations. And what he does is really fascinating. As I mentioned in the very beginning, it's kind of intuitive, but also not so much. He uses an approach very much akin to personality types to identify roles within an organization, and then helps an organization reach their most productive selves by helping everyone understand what roles they play within the organization. So let's get to it. A lot of fascinating stuff. Here is Aaron Lee on today's Good Eye Podcast. Okay, and welcome to the Good Eye Podcast. I'm talking to Aaron Lee. Aaron, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, man, you represent a subject that I think is intuitive to a lot of people, but is still kind of baffling, especially when it comes to applying what you know and your practice to themselves. I'll give a brief description, but you're a leadership coach, a growth guide, you're a special speaker. Why don't you talk a little bit about what it is exactly that you do and the various quote unquote services, including speaker, et cetera, that you bring to the table and how you help individuals and organizations?
Right. I love helping people, and somebody was asking me the other day, and I was reflecting back on what got me into this, and did I ever dream that I would be doing this? And the answer is absolutely not. Had no concept of that. But if I go back to even high school, college years, finding a way to help and serve people was my end goal, no matter what I did. And so as I got into helping leaders, teams, and organizations, I realized that in all of my experience, most of my professional experience has been in nonprofits, and I've worked for a variety of leaders. And I've realized that everybody comes in with some background, some expertise, some knowledge. But like you said, how do we know more about ourselves? And one of the phrases I use a lot is know ourselves to lead ourselves. And if we're really going to think about it, we have to learn and discover something about ourselves to be able to bring our best and to bring the best of the people that we work with, the people we lead, the people we spend time with, from family and friends to networking and community conversations in our neighborhoods and in our region. So I've been full-time in this about a year, but it was my side hustle for a few years prior to that. And I just love jumping in, helping leaders uncover a little bit more insight into themselves, learn more about their team, and then at the end of the day, have them walk away with an added insight, or say, hey, our team is functioning better now than we ever have before, thanks to the insights and what we've learned, both about ourselves and about each other.
I don't even know how one gets into this field. How did you get started, even before you started helping nonprofits? Because on your website, you say you help people who feel stuck within an organization or within their own efforts. How do you even get started in this? What's your background?
Well, my background is kind of interesting. My professional educational background, I'm actually an ordained minister, and worked in nonprofits, but alongside one of our friends was in leadership consulting, coaching, facilitating, speaking, things like that. And I have worked nearly from the beginning with her in her consulting business, more on the marketing communication side, but over time, just adding with invitation here and there. Hey, can you help with this? Hey, can you help with that? And those little steps, one by one, um, I realized, this is energizing. I love this. I love the diversity of working with multiple different clients at the same time, and helping them reach those moments of breakthrough. So, got to the point where I had taken the steps and put the pieces of the puzzle together to say, you know what, I can make the leap from the nonprofit world and do this full time, which, like I mentioned, happened last summer and has been a great ride.
So you're really service oriented. There's a spiritual, if not spiritual, an introspective level to it. You help people reach their potential. You help organizations be as efficient as they can to, correct me if I'm wrong, help each part inside that organization function its best based on the type of person or part or functioning part that it is. How do you do that? I know you work with personality profiles and things of that nature.
Yeah, so let me share one of the visuals here. This diagram shows something, and there's 5 pieces to the wheel, and so many teams hit a roadblock and say, you know what, almost with laughable predictability, this is how teams overcome a challenge. They say, you know what, we have a problem. We're going to go down here to step 3 and realign. We're going to put 2 teams together and merge them, or we're going to separate some teams out. We're going to change leaders. We're going to make some sort of structural change and try to start executing again. And this just happens across industries. It's a people thing, regardless of what specialty or expertise your organization has. But what this diagram shows, and the power of this, is that for us to increase our performance, we've got to go back to step 1 and have clear communication and healthy relationships. Because without clear communication and healthy relationships, we're never going to get to a place of rhythm and consistency in our alignment and execution. This is sequential in steps 1 through 5, but it's also a flywheel. And once this flywheel really starts spinning, that's where the beauty starts happening for an organization, where they really start to click and run on all cylinders and start cruising down the interstate of whatever their organization is about. And so this 5 voices helps us break down in 5 simple, easy to understand words, easy to remember words. Unlike a lot of the personality inventories and assessments, these 5 words make up the voice that we bring to the table. And so it allows us to better understand who we are, better understand who else is on our team, so that our communication is clear. And using this, I say, objective language, instead of guessing, instead of subjective perspective on, well, a feeling or an understanding. When we all know that the same words mean the same thing, we can have a much more objective conversation and achieve our results better, with clarity, with simplicity, and really let that flywheel of our productivity run in full tilt.
Looking at that flywheel example, it looks like, and I want to follow up on those types here in a second, but to the flywheel, it looks like a lot of organizations jump straight to execution. And almost, for lack of a better analogy, if communication gets ahead of relationships and even gets as far ahead as execution, the gears can grind based on your description. Is that apt?
Yes, exactly. And you get in this kind of rhythm where you're just not running at full speed. You just keep, it's almost like a hamster wheel instead of a flywheel. You just keep doing the same things, expecting the same results, and making tweaks and adjustments instead of a significant wholesale change that could really impact whatever the mission or a vision of your organization or business is. Um, we all have some drive that got us into what we're doing. And so the clarity that comes from the clear communication and healthy relationships as the foundation allows us to really get into then how our team is aligned. What's our mission, vision, values? How do we clarify that? How do we communicate that? It all becomes a whole lot clearer when we're all on the same page, working together, rowing in the same direction.
And I realize for people who may be listening, we're really blowing through some of these concepts because it's not a one conversation topic. You work with people over a long, protracted time. But could you give some examples of some of those personality types or some of those role types, and explain how that relates to the communication / relationships portions of your flywheel? Because that seems almost to be the most important because you're laying the foundation for an organization.
Right. So of the 5 voices, there are a few different perspectives, a few different, we'll call them spectrums, that different groupings of voices represent a different viewpoint on what's going on in the organization. They bring a different voice to the table. And yes, when you couple this with the flywheel example, there's really some power that comes in that. So on the one hand, you have from left to right these quieter voices to these louder voices. So the nurture is a quiet voice, very people oriented, very relationally focused. They're going to make everybody feel good and welcome and encouraged and part of the team. But they're not going to be quick to add their 2 cents into the team or organization. But they represent 43% of the world. And so their viewpoint is highly valued and highly necessary, but often very quiet and even unheard in the team setting. Then you've got the creative, who is way out to the horizon, looking at the future, the possibilities, scanning the future for what could be, both positive opportunities and negative risks or threats that are coming your way. They're also going to be the ones who are really strongly advocating for some sort of social conscience perspective. So they're going to be the voice for the voiceless, both internally in the organization and externally in a cause kind of viewpoint. Then you've got the guardian, who, much like the nurturer, is kind of focused on the here and the now today, but more on task and vision and process and less on people. Not to say they don't value people, but their number one go-to value is the task and the process, a manual, something that can be repeated and put into the system. So those 3 collectively are the quietest voices. And so we say 82% of people feel misunderstood or undervalued because these 2 louder voices that we're about to talk about will overshadow the other 3. So that's one of the ways we talk about this. So then we've got the connector and the pioneer, who, if you think and bring an example to mind of a connector or a pioneer, you think about somebody, a connector, who's very relationally driven. They always know somebody who can do a thing. If you have a project, an idea, you need a resource, the connectors are your go-to people to say, hey, can you help me find someone, handyman or a local business leader to help with my finances or insurance? And they just rattle off the top of their head their favorite go-to people. And they, like the nurturers, are very people oriented. But the connectors are future possibility ideas, where the nurturer is here and now in today. And then you've got the pioneer, who's the loudest of all, the trailblazer. I see where I want to go. I know how to get there. And I'm going to help us craft a plan to get from point A to our ultimate goal. And so you've got the people focus, Some are people oriented, some are not. You've got task and vision on the other end of that spectrum. Then you've got the future oriented versus the here and now. And nearly 3/4 of the population are focused on today. So more resistant to change than a quarter of us are thinking about future possibilities and ideas. And then you got the pioneer and the connector who are vocal, the front of the audience, the ones who are going to um, make a speech, share a presentation, inspire, get people excited about the possibilities. And so part of this comes down to even as simple as making sure each person, each voice represents their perspective. Because when you put all five together, you get a more well-rounded perspective on what it is that we're trying to do in this next season of our organization. If you get too many future-oriented voices and not enough present-oriented to rein them in, you're just shooting from the hip almost. Every time you turn around, there's another project, another change, another initiative. Whereas the flip side, if you have too many nurturers and guardians kind of focused on today, you may not be pushing that envelope enough. And so we talk about those future oriented voices want to move at about 80, maybe 100 miles an hour. The present oriented want to go at about 20. And the compromise is somewhere around 30. It's still a whole lot faster than 20 miles an hour to get to 30, but it's a lot slower than that 80, 100 miles an hour that the creatives, the connectors, the pioneers want to blaze new trails with. So having that objective understanding gives everybody almost a breath of fresh air in the room that, okay, let me check myself. I'm a pioneer. Guns blazing all the time. Oh, wait, I'm talking too much. Let me hit timeout for myself and let some other voices speak into the room. We all have that we just need to be aware of.
But doesn't applying those labels require a certain amount of buy-in? Do you ever find pioneers who think they're nurturers or connectors who don't know they're creatives, etc.?
Yes, absolutely.
Does it get sticky? Can that get sticky for you?
It can get sticky. It actually just happened this morning. I was on with a 4-person nonprofit team from Tennessee. We were doing this virtually. And one of the team members, who I kind of knew his personality, his perspective, I was pretty sure he was a connector. But there's part of the description that, especially for a connector, they're so relationally focused. If somebody says something that's going to be challenging for them, or they have to bring challenge to somebody else, raise the bar, raise the expectation, they really shy away from giving and receiving that because they're so relationally focused. So as I describe that, I find sometimes connectors say, oh, that doesn't sound too positive because it's challenging. And they kind of shy away. Oh, maybe that's not me. I'm like, no, this is absolutely you. And so in this team this morning, one of the other team members got a few levels later. We were finished looking at all the voices, and she said, so can we come back to this? Because I think that describes you to a T. And so there was some, it's highly interactive, lots of conversation, completely unlike a lot of assessments where you sit down in front of a computer screen and answer 60 or 80 questions. We have that version too. But when we really get into it, you find a lot more understanding as we go through the nuances of each voice and then reinforce that.
Okay, so you've got your voices, and the goal is growth and self-identification, or at least self-understanding. How much of this also replies on back to buy-in within the organization? How realistic is it for modern organizations, I think becoming more so, to allow the growth, to give the room to let people understand their role within the organization and even get to that point without jumping straight to execution. Because, bottom line results is, usually what speaks
Right.
loudly.
Yes. So you start to factor in issues of employee engagement, which is a really big term. But one report on talent optimization last year said 49% of top performers left their jobs last year. And so you start to factor in the financial ramifications and effects of losing your top people, not letting your top people bring their best, and start to multiply that out. Then factor in replacement training costs, recruiting, lost productivity. There's a big difference there that organizations are starting to realize, if we invest a little bit here in building up the team that we have, there are longer term benefits that come from this that we wouldn't see otherwise. And I think the adoption, even the invitation to come in and start having these conversations, certainly takes a different kind of leader, a different leadership team, a leadership team willing to do the hard work themselves and say, I want to know myself better to lead myself and our team and our organization better. There's a little bit of humility and breaking down the wall of self-preservation.
Ooh, well put. Now, do you find that organizations themselves have voices? Sometimes do they have trouble coming to terms with reality? Maybe they're a creative organization that doesn't want to get organized, or simply a sales-driven, numbers-driven organization that needs a little bit more nurturing and creative voices.
Yes, there are definitely, this definitely poses a challenge because some organizations are so heavily weighted based on what they do. I've worked with elementary education teams. In an elementary school, what voice is prevalent amongst all the rest? Much higher proportion of nurturers. That's what you expect. I even tee that up in a workshop session to say, you probably remember either a grandparent or an early teacher that you had who was just so caring. Much higher proportion of elementary educators are nurturers. Then you get into a finance division, and naturally you want the guardians to make sure that the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, the details are in place. You've got some systems ready to go. Those are the people you want leading that side of the organization, or on a larger level, the whole organization. And so I think as you start to see leaders rise up, it's in the levels of leadership where other voices can come in. I was talking to a salesman yesterday, and we were talking about that age-old analogy of promoting the best salesperson to be the team leader. Well, that's a double whammy of now you have somebody who's not a natural team leader leading people, and you've just lost your top salesperson.
Mm-hmm.
And he was that opposite personality of, he's a great people person. He could lead the team. His go-to was not on the sales side, but it was in that realm that he was able to bring his best. And so I think that's where you start to see outliers. And in some teams, there was a big finance division I did this with. Vast majority of their team were guardians. They had 2 nurturers, and one had already given her 2 weeks notice. Well, that one nurturer who's left has a much larger burden, but that just elevates the importance of that voice in the imbalance of the rest of the team to bring what the nurturer does best. And the same goes for any voice to speak up, to bring their best for the organization's best.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Speaking of those different roles and working together, what size organizations do you typically work with? And what I'm asking is, can an organization be too small, say 2 or 3 people who might not even represent all the different voices? Do you sort of require all the voices in order to work with them? And is that a best case scenario? And then I'll follow up with something else.
Yeah, so the team of 4 that I worked with this morning has one missing voice. And so we'll oftentimes find, even if we're in a whole organization, a larger organization, it's a small team that may have one voice missing from within that intact team. And so I've done this as teams as small as one person, a small nonprofit that only had one staff person. And so then what we talk about is, how do you get a personal focus group or board of advisors to get some outside perspective? All of us can pivot and ask ourselves, what would this other voice say? And we can try to think about it. It takes a little bit of extra work. It's not how we just naturally go about it. But on the flip side, I have friends and fellow consultants across the country who are working and meeting today, even with branches of the U.S. military and Google. And so from a team of 1 to really, really large organizations, it's something that easily scales no matter how large your organization is.
Okay, the follow-up is, within an organization, and assuming there's multiple voices of the same kind, what's the best case scenario, or is there one, within the organization for various voices to work together? Is it the far ends of the spectrum, one-on-one, complementing each other, or is it, say, 2 nurturers, 2 pioneers? How does that work?
Yeah, so one of the things I love in diving into the voices is we start with that introspective personal look. But then as we get into layer after layer, we start to build out, okay, how does your team best function? And so one of the keys is as simple as, the nurturers are going to be the quietest ones. Make sure you let them speak first. Naturally, the pioneer is going to jump in at the outset and say, I know what we need to do. We don't need anybody else's perspective. I've got it up here. Let's go. And so the nurturer adds a different perspective, a different bent, and a different filter for the pioneer to think about and process. And the same with each of the voices. So we talk about the order from quietest to loudest, not in some, okay, nurturers up first, okay, now creatives, now guardians, but you get that rhythm and you start to feel, oh, we didn't hear from this group of the room, or, well, now we need to elevate this part of the team. And one of the other interesting things that I keep finding, I find it happen in one of 2 ways. Either people walk through the 5 voices and start to have language to describe what they're already doing, or it highlights the imbalance that exists. And so I found numerous times already, we talk about and kind of joke sometimes that the pioneers and the nurturers are polar opposites. But what I have found is really, really interesting is really strong, healthy, mature pioneers and strong, self-confident nurturers have naturally just found each other, and they bounce things off of each other, and they go consult with each other, and they lean into each other and realize, okay, you have the complete opposite perspective of what I have. What's your take on this? And so they've developed that co-working relationship that allows them, that's step 2, relationship, healthy relationships. They formed that healthy relationship so that the capacity and the productivity can increase.
And if you back up a step to communication, it almost requires that, self-understanding facilitates communication, which facilitates relationships, et cetera, down the line.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
is there a particular voice within the organization that is best at, number one, facilitating your process, and number two, initially reaching out to someone like you?
I don't know that it's a particular voice. Um, I think it's more about the pain or the stress or the challenge that they're feeling. It's having that awareness that, we are missing something. We're something's out of alignment and we need to put our finger on it. One of the beautiful things is our our 360 assessment. We can run every team member in an organization through, and it categorizes the ratings of your organization, how employees perceive their team, the environment, all of those dynamics based on the 5 stages of that flywheel. And so then we know specifically which piece to dive into and press into a little bit further, and which we can kind of introduce some language and move on from there to help reinforce that. um, so I think it's anybody who sees the challenge and
Mm-hmm.
is in a place and is willing to do something about it. And you see in different times and in different seasons different voices in key leadership roles in the higher leadership of an organization. And you can just as easily see a guardian or a nurturer as a president or executive director as you see a pioneer or a creative connector. Um, it depends on the season of life of the organization, what they feel like they need, and where they are in the life cycle.
I feel like this conversation has almost been taking place in a vacuum, given how business has been traditionally organized and executed. How has the whole new reality of virtual business and interaction affected what you do, and or has it? What changes have come about given the dynamic, fluid nature of organizational interaction these days?
Yes, there are a number of things that have shifted. There are a few things that thankfully haven't, um, thanks to ingenuity and forethought from the global network of consultants that I'm connected to. So I have spent a lot of time in virtual meetings, coaching one-on-one remotely, working with leaders from a distance. And so having that traction has helped me and helped my counterparts shift gears a little bit to continue serving our clients. Um, like I mentioned, the team of 4, we did that workshop this morning online via Zoom. We even had breakout rooms so they could have one-on-one conversation, debriefing, and letting some of this sink in, and using those tools. One of the things that I think leaders are seeing, and if they haven't seen yet, they probably will before too long, is remote work and being separated doesn't diminish the challenges that were already there. It only probably turns up the heat on them a little bit more. It might take a little bit longer for something to boil to the surface, but the same challenges that we all bring to the table are just as present when we're working remotely as they are when we're in the same physical space. And so I think it's even more important right now for leaders, for organizations to understand and have some common language of how are we bringing out the best in our team members? How are we empowering each voice, making sure we're hearing each perspective? Because it's even easier to hide in a virtual meeting than it is to hide in a conference room when you don't want to speak up. That was me in middle school and high school. I've been the quiet one on the back row,
Mm-hmm.
and it's certainly a whole lot easier on an online meeting. So all of these little pieces kind of stack up to get to the importance of why it's just as important now to work on your team, because under stress, getting back to that 49% of top performers leaving last year, people may hang on a little bit longer to the comfort and security of a role. Um, but that doesn't mean that their productivity and their efficiency and their contribution to the team and the organization is going to be at the level that you need for success. And so how do you create that environment? It's just as important now as ever.
I guess their continued productivity helps the organization retain them and afford them. Otherwise, given this fluid environment, it would probably be pretty difficult to retain your top performers without something with which to perform.
Right. You've got to have those results, and back to that flywheel. The summation of the flywheel is the productivity, the capacity, the output of the organization, and from all of the 360 assessments we've done, we find that most teams sit somewhere around 60% of their true potential. And so there's a gap there that almost every organization has room to grow, if they'll make the investment and work on these hard interpersonal things. We go to school for our degree, our certification. We get some letters before or after our name, but we never graduate from this school of self-awareness and learning about ourselves and how we can bring out the best from the people around us.
Self-awareness and rolling into that mindfulness can be hard work, but do you find that organizations are, quote unquote, happier after having done that work and sort of figuring out who they are? Not only more productive, but happier?
Yeah. So
more fulfilled, maybe? Yeah.
Sorry?
More fulfilled, maybe?
Yeah. So we use the word liberation. And on the one hand, you have an environment that's very relationally driven, very supportive, very encouraging. But if all you ever have is encouragement, then I can encourage you and I can encourage your coworker across the hall. But if I'm not holding either of you accountable, then you both feel like you're right. And then you get together and say, well, I want to go left and he wants to go right. And the boss said yes to both. Which is it? And so you end up having mistrust and problems there. On the flip side, you've got, hey, we have results, we have deadlines, we have goals, we've got to meet these. You've got a supervisor or a boss who's just driving that constantly. And liberation is the art of balancing those two, the right amount at the right time, calibrating them, helping to understand. I'm naturally going to come, me personally, from a challenge perspective. I got to work really hard to be supportive, to be relationally focused. And I'm sure the same is true. And so for me right now in this season, I'm realizing I need to be all the more supportive because everything we're experiencing around us is so challenging. Mm-hmm. So how do I get to that place of support? But the idea of liberation in balancing those two together, we say it's fighting for the highest possible good of those you lead. And if we're fighting for each other, that liberation is freeing, it's fulfilling, it's a more engaged work environment. We want to be there. We recognize that when somebody challenges us, they're doing it out of our best interest, not out of some self-serving gain. And so it's an entire shift to get to this place of liberation, but it's one that certainly affects all of these dynamics that we've talked about in terms of productivity and increased engagement and retaining your top talent.
The sports analogy keeps coming to mind, a hard-nosed coach who just wants you to become your best. It's a little bit easier to take in that context than in a hit your sales numbers context,
Yes, exactly.
Talk about your speaking a little bit. You do speaking engagements. You can't possibly go in and talk about all this stuff all at once. What are some of the things you talk about and address, and what are some of the groups you talk to?
So I have done this five voices as a stage presentation, which is a little more challenging, but because you're in an arena or group environment, you still have the opportunity to have people in conversation with the person sitting next to them. But one of the things that I love when I'm speaking is breaking down each of these tools. Introduce two or three because they're simple, they're sticky, and they're memorable. So when I introduce this to a group in the morning, and they go back maybe that afternoon to their workplace or over a lunch meeting with somebody who wasn't in the session, they can teach somebody on the back of the napkin because it's so practical and they can put it into practice immediately. um, and remember it. It's not a large significant concept. And so there's probably 40, 45 different of these visual tools that create what we call the 100x system of being 100% healthy and multiplying that health and vitality of the organization. And so each of the tools, I joke sometimes that there's a tool for everything, but there is. We talked about self-preservation a few minutes ago, and here's our tool for self-preservation. That we look at this wall and we try to break through the wall, and sometimes we're trying to prove something, we're trying to not lose something, we're trying to hide shortcoming or weakness. um, And so just reflecting on these three questions can help somebody get to a place of self-confidence where they can come into a conversation and be able to bring their best. One of the others is building a bridge. We talked about the difference of the voices a little while ago, that some are here and now and today, and others are out into the future and the possibility. And for us to change speeds, and either as a future oriented voice to slow down to 30 miles an hour or as a present oriented voice to speed up to 30, we have to build a bridge. And if I am blazing a trail and want to get everybody on board, I've got to lay out the details of that plan so that the guardians and nurturers can see, here's plank by plank, guardrail by guardrail, how I get from this side of the cliff to the other side of the cliff. Because my nature is, if I see the other side of the cliff, I'll jump, I'll get a parachute, I'll get a helicopter. I don't care what. I see the other side and I want to go. But not everybody does. And so these simple, uh, straightforward but powerful visual tools help us lay that out. And so I love telling stories, personal stories from my life, coupled with those tools to help liberate people. Really, it comes back to that one word so often for me, is helping people reach their true potential by liberating them and hopefully allowing them to liberate their families, their coworkers, their community around them.
Sounds like some of the vanguard industries during the Industrial Revolution were not interested in this system at all. It was, it's interesting the evolution that the working environment, the workers' structure goes through, whether it's just a cog in a machine or having room to grow and evolve and understand yourself, and whether they business-minded business entities like it or not, people are definitely evolving and finding that they need to be heard, however that is. And it sounds like this is one more step along that bridge you were just showing towards discovering how each individual can be valuable within the organization.
Yes, I think at some point, I keep looking at this current coronavirus response, this season that we're in, of wondering what's next, what's going to change, what's going to be different. And I think, to the point you just made, there's going to be a different set of questions or a different line of thinking, a different feeling and sense of purpose in our work that's going to drive how we work together, how we interact together, how we bridge family and community life and work life, it's going to look different. What is it going to look like? I don't think any of us are quite sure
Mm-hmm.
yet, but I think these are the kinds of questions that people will continue to ask in the coming months and years.
And you'll be there to answer them.
I hope I will be. Yes.
It's got a little Myers-Briggs to it. We talked about that offline before. There's definitely some personality to I guess Myers-Briggs is sort of passé these days, but there's some validity there.
Yes, there's decades of research that went into Myers-Briggs even before that system was developed, and this sought to take some of that data and make it more digestible, more team friendly. In this digital age, we've got to be highly visual. We've got to be interactive and memorable. And in the fast-paced environment that we're in, it's hard to say, okay, I, S, or F, T, or what's my combination again?
Yeah.
And then what does that mean? And so the five voices, having simply five words to describe that, there's so many layers and nuance that helps it be quick and easy to remember when you jump into a conversation with somebody.
So of the voices, which one are you, or which ones do you gravitate to?
Yeah, so I am a pioneer first, that loud, quick to speak, trailblazing. I see the opportunity, I'm ready to go. My second is creative. And so that's not my autopilot, but I see the possibilities. I see the potential, which I also love that perspective, bringing that into the work I'm doing with teams and organizations, because I can kind of sit back and take in the whole landscape of where they are and what's going on, and maybe dream some new dreams, or bring a new perspective for the future that maybe even the pioneers in the organization hadn't thought about yet, just from their vantage point and where they sit.
Interesting. Cool. And if people want to find out more and get in contact with you, aaronlee.co is the best place to do that?
That's the best place. I'm posting updates on the blog, connections to my social media accounts there, and a couple links to assessments, both the online version of the 5 voices, so you can find your own voice, and there's another assessment that I use that's also linked there as well. So both of those are free. Try them out, check them out. I love to connect with anybody.
aaronlee.co. Cool. Aaron, thanks for being here. This is fascinating. We could go on forever just talking about the nuance of the human condition as it applies to commerce, but I guess we'll have to leave it there until next time.
Yes, until next time. Thanks, Jay. I appreciate it.
Okay, man. I appreciate it as well. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks again to Aaron for coming by for that conversation here on the Good Eye Podcast. And you can find out all about him at aaronlee.co. That's AARONLEE.co. And look at what he has to offer. He might help out your organization when it comes to finding its most productive self, as an organization. So first he focuses on the little selves and then the overall big self of the organization. Hit me up here if I can help with any more information. Thanks for listening. As always, go to goodeyepodcast.com for any information, and you can follow the links there to get in touch if you have topic/guest/booking ideas, and I do appreciate it. So until next time, I'll talk to you here very soon on the next Good Eye Podcast.